Alright, now that we're done with the slide, which is pretty straightforward, we go into a little more in-depth view into the FNS-9 pistol. Now this is the compact version, which there's some slight differences. As far as I'm aware, the only difference is the takedown lever is larger, much larger on the full size. You can actually see the round end of the takedown lever on the full size. The magazine release spring is different, and the backstrap retaining method is different. The full size uses just a piece of spring steel in there that you depress and slide off the backstrap. Now, what we're going to do this in two parts. This part is going to be the firing control group, it's pretty simple to remove. We'll just need a punch. It's not the right size punch. Let me see. Here we go. Well, I guess you could use that one. Now it's just a simple roll pin, which aren't directional. And now I just place a roll pin or a punch into the roll pin. Now I'm doing this off frame because I can't drive a pin out on the table. It doesn't clear. But basically all you do is you put the punch down on the pin, hold it down steady, and just alright, and just give it a couple good taps, and then the pin should come out. Now, this one, let's see. There we go. There we go. My punch isn't long enough for it to clear all the way through, but that's fine. So, roll pin out. Now, there's only one more thing that's holding your fire control group into the frame, which is the trigger bar. Now we can look inside of the frame here. This is the slide lock bar, which is independent of the trigger bar, which runs there. So you can see it moving, which actuates the sear. So what we'll have to do is lift out the firing control group. You're wanting to put tension on both sides because these are it's just two halves that aren't really held together by anything. Also, this bar that the roll pin goes through is also holding in the mechanism that only allows the sear to drop, or it only allows the sear to drop whenever the gun is in full battery. So you want to hold all of that while pinching, and you're going to pull up. Now you see that the pin just came free. There's a pin that runs through the trigger bar and in through the assembly. You don't want to drive the pin through. Now the pin isn't held in by anything, you can just push it through. But you don't want to push it through because there's a spring that pin is holding, along with holding it to the bar. So you just push it out enough just for it to clear the bars. Just tilt it around and do your best to get it out. Alright, come on. It's never as easy on camera as it is off camera. So, come on now. It's not wanting to get out. There we go. That's free. So you can set the frame aside. We'll get to that later. We're left with our fire control group. Now, fortunately, you can see that there's a spring, a loop of a spring that's held on this bar. This is the bar that goes on the trigger bar, or the rod that goes through the trigger bar. So now we're just going to disassemble it. You're going to remove this piece while holding down tension on the that mechanism and that will just pop out. There's not a whole lot of tension on it. And you'll just get this piece and the spring, which goes on the rod there. I will do that later. Now, as it sits here, there's not a whole lot of tension on it. You just can lift away the clamshell. And this is the guts. This is the guts of the trigger control group. Now we'll lift this out. Now if you saw, there's this pin that came out. This pin goes through this loop right here, which is basically just, it's like a return spring for the sear. It's pulling the sear back that way. After you pull the trigger back, it pulls the sear back. This spring, which is basically stretched out like this, is to return the sear back. Now, try to explain this as best as I can. So there's two pins. This front pin, which of course goes through the trigger bar, it sits right here in this gap in the clamshell. The small pin that fell out earlier goes into this notch. This top pin that acts as kind of like a sear pivot pin goes into this slot. So just to explain how all that breaks down. So you can remove this pin. Make sure not to lose that little spring. So we're left with just the sear, the spring, and this assembly with the disconnector leg. Now you can see how the sear is situated on this assembly. Got this little dog leg that's interfacing with this rear part of the assembly here, keeping the sear from coming up too high. That's how it's positioned, and I guess we could call it a carrier. Now we can remove the pin. Just put your fingers around it to keep the spring captive once you pull the rod out. And it'll lift up on the sear, and you just have a simple spring. Now, as you can see in this spring, it has that little leg and then a straight portion here. That little leg goes into a small hole that you can see. There we are. There's a small hole right there, just above the pin, the retaining rod. So that's how the spring locates in there. So that's basically the striker assembly, or the firing controls assembly. Disassembly isn't terribly difficult. After you do this a couple times, you figure some stuff out, little tricks and things. So we'll just place the sear on this carrier, I guess this is what we're calling it now, through. And you do this without the spring. And I kind of adopted this technique from the CZs. If you ever taken apart a CZ, it's a whole lot of pushing pins through and pushing springs into place, at least on the older. I haven't messed around with the Omega trigger sets, but it's pretty similar affair. What you're going to do is just basically push this into place. Spring is just going to be set down in there and just positioned to where it needs to be, which is something to that effect. Just sitting there in the carrier. And then I take a wider punch and push it down till it lines up with the pin, and we'll push the pin through. Now that locates the spring in the proper place. Take my punch again, and what I'm doing is I'm going to go through the front, right here, just to basically position that little leg to seat into the hole, and just kind of finagle it in place. It's not terribly far off. And let me see if I can, I don't have all my punches here, so we just this little flat head and push that. There we go. Yeah, just pushed it down in, pushed it over. So that's that is together now, functioning properly, spring seated, perfect. Now we got, let's see, I guess we'll just do it this way. Now there's this little part that's been milled in, or I don't know, this is probably like MIM or something, but like I said before, this is how it slots in. This pin goes into the slot here, and these little legs go into that small slot that's in the carrier. That's how it slides back and forth. Now, looking at that, we know that it's sliding back and forth, which is what's basically this spring here keeps tension on it. And like I said, acts as a return spring. So we'll take, this is larger of the two pins. I'm just going to place in here, and we'll take the spring and just kind of locate it, push the pin through. Now, it doesn't like to line up properly, but just a couple of taps with the mallet, it'll go through. So we've got that's what we have now. And now we'll locate all of the parts where they need to go, which, well, just like we demonstrated, nothing different than before. Slides free. And what we'll do is we'll take the small pin, put it through the second loop of the spring, and pull it down. Now I pinch the front, this, and the rear just to keep the pin from flopping out. And then I take the other half and just line it up and push it into place. Just wiggle, make sure it's all seated properly. And then I can properly locate this pin. There we go. And that pin just sits there in that groove. So we can see that I now have spring tension. Now, while holding this together, we're going to take the mechanism that keeps the gun from only firing when it's in battery. Place it in like that. Now it slots into this oblong hole, and then the other end, that little rod, goes through that hole there. This all locks in place. So you're going to locate it and just pull the assembly forward so it clears the sear. There we go. So you're going to pull the assembly forward. As you can see, it obstructs that block. So pull the assembly forward, and this is very difficult on camera. There we go. Pull the assembly forward so that you can push the block in, and it will all lock together. So that's all together. Ooh. Now there's a lot of spring tension on this now, so it's a great time to replace this little band that holds it together. Like this assembly like this, I usually take this rod and push it over so that when I raise the trigger bar, I can line that flush up to it and push the bar on through. And all lines up, just like that. And replace the pin and drive it down and you're done.